Okay, everybody, like I said, hope you're staying well and staying safe wherever you are. And like I said, it's going to be a little chilly tonight, but just dress appropriately and we should be good to go. So let's jump in a little bit. I want to talk. Let me add one more to our room here. I want to spend a minute talking about this week's Parsha. One second. There we go. I want to spend some time talking about this week's Parsha. And in particular, I want to talk about the notion of justice. How do we define justice in a Torah sense, right? So if somebody does something wrong, again, a person goes and, I don't know, gouges out somebody's eyes or chops off another person's hand or whatever they might do, how do we define, what kind of punishment should that person receive? What would we define as justice? What are the most important principles of justice in the Torah's vocabulary?
You have to look at the intent of the person who you're trying to judge, whether or not what he did was bad or good. Maybe his intent was good, or maybe he was doing something good, but it looked like he was doing something bad. And to mete out justice is not a solid thing. It's like air, what's justice for one man is not justice for another.
Oh, so good. So you're saying some really important things here. Thank you. So in my mind, I see a few different competing ideals when it comes to justice. And by justice, I mean some form of punishment. So for example, do we punish somebody, or do we offer justice or consequences for a person's actions because we're trying to create restitution for the person who was harmed? Alternatively, is the purpose of justice from a Torah's perspective retribution, punishment, right? What about rehabilitation? Or because we want to make things better for that person? Or is the purpose of creating justice about deterrence, because we don't want anybody else to do it again? So those four are the ones I came up with. Those are like kind of competing objectives. What do you think is the main driver for the Torah's form of justice? Again, when a person gouges out another person's eye, chops off their arm, they hurt them in some way, what form of punishment should he receive and why? Is the goal to create restitution, retribution, rehabilitation, or deterrence? What do you think?
Doesn't it go back to the old thing that I know this is an old bromide, as an eye for an eye? In other words, the punishment should not be worse than the crime.
I agree, but what is the purpose of the punishment? Is the punishment to punish a person and say shame on you? Is the purpose of the punishment to create to deter anyone from ever doing it again? Or is it to create restitution? The person who got hurt, we want to create restitution for him. So for example, in a perfect world, let's say again, a person chops off another person's hand. And Herbie make an important point about intentionality and things like that. But let's put that aside just for a moment. If a person chops off another person's hand, what form of punishment should he receive? So maybe you would argue in a perfect world, what would happen? Well, Mr. X, he goes and he chops off Mr. Y's hand. So what would be the perfect justice? We should take Mr. Y's hand, chop it off, and go give it to Mr. X. Would that be perfect justice?
No, because both people would be without a hand. I mean, what purpose was that?
Right. So given the reality, right? So Brenda's saying correctly, given the reality that this is not really medically feasible. I mean, maybe it is, but it's not realistic, right? Given the fact that we can't medically transplant, the attacker's arm to the victim's arm. So how do we achieve justice? So on the one hand, we can exact the eye or the hand of the aggressor. That might be the most effective form of deterrence, right? People will be much more careful if they know they're going to lose their hand or their eye if they did it, even if we couldn't transplant it. But this method doesn't give any tangible benefit whatsoever to the injured party. The person who lost his eye, what does he gain if somebody else loses his arm or his eye? Maybe he feels better for a minute, but he still lost his eye or his arm. On the other hand, if we think about it in terms of monetary payments, so that absolutely could help the victim pay for his loss of vision, pay for his loss of being able to work. He only has one hand. All that makes total sense, right? That all is very logical. But on the flip side, it doesn't give any satisfying sense of retribution. So when we think about justice, what is our goals for justice? Is our goals to make the victim whole in terms of retribution? Is it meant to create restitution, or is it meant to create retribution? Is justice meant to really hurt a person? And I want to get even with you. What are we hoping to achieve when the Torah creates laws for justice? When we dole out punishments, what are we trying to achieve with it? And this is really one of the major themes of this week's Parsha. Parshat Mishpatim literally means the laws. And I want to share with you a few verses, and let's see just reading them on their face, what we think they might mean. So take a look over here. So let me just extend this a little bit. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. So the Torah tells us in box number 1, V'chi yinatzu anashim. If we find that two men were fighting, v'nagfo isha hara, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, v'yatzu yilada, and she miscarries, v'lo ye'ason, and but there is no other damage that occurs, anosh ye'anesh, so the one responsible needs to be punished, kasher asit ala bal haishav natan biflilim. He should be fined accordingly as the woman's husband may exact from him the payment to based on reckoning. The imasonia, but if he creates damage, again, so that's where he actually hurts her in some way, chops off her arm or eye or something like that, v'natata nefesh tachat nafesh. The penalty is a life for a life. Ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye. Shein tachat shein, a tooth for a tooth. Yad tachat yad, a hand for hand. A regel tachat ragel, a foot for a foot. Kiviyah tachat kiviyah, petza tachat petza, chabura tachat chabura, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. So what seems to be the implication here? How do we, or let me read again another one, Vayikra, same idea. If you maim a person, so shall be done to you. Shever tachat shever, a fracture for a fracture, ayin tachat ayin, eye for an eye, shein tachat shein, a tooth for a tooth, kasher ten mum ba'adam, kinin naten bo. The injury that you afflict on another person, that should happen to you. So when we read these verses and we read them for face value, what does the Torah seem to be suggesting? It seems to suggest that the penalties of all these different forms of assault and battery in any way that you hurt a person are meant to be taken literally, right? It's meant to be about retaliation, measure for measure. It's physical punishment, right? It's retribution, right? And maybe in a sense, a little deterrence. If you know that you might lose your arm over this, well, you might be a lot more careful around other people if you know that there's such a stiff penalty for this. But the person who is afflicted, the victim, what does the victim get when you do ayin tachat ayin? What does he get?
Punishment.
What was that?
Punishment.
No, meaning the aggressor, the guy who cuts off the hand, he gets punished.
Right.
From the victim's perspective, does he get any?
Victim. He doesn't really get anything. To me, justice is more or less in the eyes of the beholder. The society you live in has laws, and justice is defined as keeping the law. So in this circumstance that we read, we go by the law, whether we like it or not. That's the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. It's a really good
Isn't
point.
justice involved in correcting a wrong? I mean, there are wrong done. Shouldn't justice means that if a wrong is done, then it should be corrected in some way or punished in some way. We're arguing about the punishment. We're not arguing about the whether justice is done or not.
So how would you? I think they're the same question. I actually think they're exactly the same question. How do you find justice? That's exactly what we're asking. How do you find justice for the victim in a case where his hand got chopped off? If you take an eye for an eye and an arm for an arm, so how do we make him whole? Because you took some other guys, that's retribution. That's deterrence. That's not restitution. You're not making him whole. How are you making him whole?
You can't.
So, and by the way, let me give you one other example, just where you see the Torah's ideals here, right? V'asitim lo kasher zamam. So what happens when you've got two witnesses? The Torah tells us that we always need two witnesses. The witnesses come and they testify and they talk to, and they testify and they come and they are these witnesses. And what happens in a situation where those witnesses actually lied? They're proven to be faulty witnesses. So the Torah tells us, "V'asitim lo kasher zamam lasot le'achiv." You should do to them exactly as they scheme to do to his fellow. Thus you should sweep out evil from your midst. Everybody else will be afraid. They'll be very conscious. In other words, if you think there's no consequence of testifying falsely, guess what? Whatever it is that you try to befall on a person, that comes right back to you. And the Torah says explicitly this is all about deterrence. Everyone will hear and be afraid, and such evil things will not again be done in your midst. People are going to say, wow, that's serious. That's a very stiff punishment. And so it seems from, at least on the face of it, from the simple reading of the text, it seems to appear the Torah favors retribution over, for example, financial compensation, right? Over this notion of restitution. That's what it seems like. That's what we care about the most. And yet, if we look back, this was chapter 21, verse 22. If you look at the verses right beforehand in box number 4, let's see how this reads, a different case. When men quarrel, if a man hits his fellow with a stone or with his fist, but he doesn't die, but he falls down and he hurts himself, meaning he's bedridden. If he can get up and walk outside with his staff, meaning he can go out, and the assailant shall go unpunished. The only thing he's going to have to pay in that situation is for idleness and his cure, right? Shevet and ripoy. He's got to pay his medical expenses, and he's got to also pay, besides his medical expenses, he also needs to take care of his any lost wages, which we'll see in a few minutes. So this seems to imply this is a different form of justice. This is again talking about compensation. Paying somebody, this is restitution, right? A person was hurt, he was lost. So using this as an example, if we were to chop off his hand, so give him restitution, give him financial payments. And so the question is, how do all these different factors affect the verdict? For example, if let's say one of the assailant or the victim was rich, or alternatively poor, or what about a person in a situation where you knock out someone's baby tooth? Not his real tooth, a baby tooth, right? How does that work? Or again, should the potential for additional medical complications that might come from giving some corporal punishment impact our ability to do so? So these are all difficult questions, and this could be the reason why that the overwhelming sense in the Torah, in Chazal, in the rabbinic literature, is that, and the Gemara says that what we really talk about here is that when it comes to bodily harm, it's really restitution rather than retribution. It's really financial payments instead of trying to hurt another person. And yet, the Torah doesn't say that explicitly. So what I want to spend the rest of our time doing is, how do we understand the fact that the Torah quite explicitly says eye for an eye, an arm for an arm? It says it explicitly. How do we make sense of this literal sense in the Torah with this other pasuk here in box number 4, which seems to imply that there is some level of financial retribution? So there are actually two different approaches that are taken. One is that it is meant to be taken quite literally. That's the first possibility. Look at Josephus for a minute. Josephus writes in Antiquities that one who causes an injury to his fellow shall pay him measure for measure and lose the same limb of which he deprived his fellow, unless the one who was injured prefers to receive monetary compensation. So Josephus tells us that this is, in fact, the decision lies with the injured party, And if he seeks revenge, so then the perpetrator's punishment is he's going to lose his eye. But if the injured party wants compensation, he wants money, so then he should get money for it. He has a choice. That's justice, Josephus says. On the other hand, others suggest that it's different, and this is similar to the notion of like midah keneged midah. We know that God judges the world measure for measure, and so it's a similar idea. Or for instance, in Megillat Ta'anit, it describes here I never say it right, Baitusian. So it says over here that the book of decisions, the Baitusians, the Sadducees used to say eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. In other words, if a person knocked out his friend's tooth, then his own tooth should be knocked out. If he blinded his friend, he too shall be blinded, and then this way they shall be equal. Hayu shavim ke'achad. That's an important line here, right? That the person who commits the assault, he deserves to be no better off than his victim. So the principle treats all people as equal. It doesn't matter if they're wealthy or not. It doesn't matter what their background is. If you maim a person, then you have to be in the same position as them. And so how do we define and understand this pasuk here that talks about financial compensation in box 4? So maybe we can suggest that it's referring to additional payments, meaning at its most basic level, just basic, it is an eye for an eye. But maybe there's an additional component where we want to create a sense of restitution besides just retribution. So that's one possibility. The more common approach, which can be found here in the Mishnah in Baba Kama, and I want to study this with you for a minute, is that what we really say eye for an eye, what we're really talking about here is absolutely monetary financial pieces. The hope is that the financial pieces are so significant that they do form a sense of deterrence, but that the real goal here is to make the other person whole. So when we say ayin tachan ayin, nefesh tachan nefesh, a life for life, what we really mean is justice is defined not by retribution, but justice is defined by restitution, where we try to make the person whole again. And so the Mishnah says as follows. There's actually, what the heck? Hi, is everyone still with me?
Yes.
I lost you for a second. That was the weirdest thing ever. Hold on one second. Let me just, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, I'm back. Technology, weird. Sorry, someone sent into chat. Okay. So let's, I don't know who knocked me out over there. So let me jump back here. We're just reading the Mishnah here. That was strange. So the Mishnah tells us that there are really 5 categories of payments. So when you hurt a person, we say financial restitution. What does that mean? How do we define it? What do you think? What are ways that a person can achieve that? So let's talk about it. So one is what we would call maybe nezek, which is the injury itself, right? So if you blind a person or you cut off their arm, right? So you created damage to his body. How do you calculate that? So the Mishnah is going to tell us in a second. Let's look at the Mishnah. So the first one is called nezek. So the Mishnah explains as follows. How do you do that? If you injure a person, you're liable for 5 different things. Nezek, tsar, ripoy, shevet, and boshet. You have to pay 5 payments. Nezek, compensation for the injury. Tsar, which is the pain. Ripoy is like all the doctor's payments. Shevet is loss of wages, and boshet is embarrassment. But how does it work? Benezek, ketzad. How does it work? So sima eno, kata jado, shiber raglo. Let's say you break his leg, you cut off his hand, you blind a person. Roi no tokiluhu eved nimkar bashuk. So we evaluate how much he's worth as a slave in the free market. V'shamim kamaya yafeh v'chamayahu yafeh. So it's very simple. We go in and we say, a person like this, how much would he be worth in the open market? So we evaluate if he had both of his hands and his full vision, how much would someone pay for him as a slave? Now that we take away his hand or his leg or his eye, how much is he worth today? The difference creates a monetary component called nezek, and that's the amount of money that a person needs to pay. That's the first one. The second one, how do we figure out tsar, pain, tsar? So kvau b'shapud ovesim tsar. So let's say a person burns a person with a skewer, with a hot nail, right? Or alternatively, afil al tziporno, even burns him with his fingernail some way. So mekom she'ena osa chabura, omdin kama adam kayotze beze rotze lito liot mitzdarkach. So how do we evaluate? How do we put a financial number on sa'ar? We go out and find out how much would a person be willing to let you pay to do something like that to them. So you go on the street and you say, hey, I have a burning hot nail and I want to go and put that burning hot nail in your arm. No way, don't touch me with that. So how do you do it? How do you calculate? You say to a person, I'll give you $5 to do it. The guy says, $5, make it 1,000. You got yourself a deal. So all of a sudden you put a price on the pain. A person's willing to endure a certain amount of pain for $1,000. Similar, ripui. This is simple. Like, how do you deal with that? That's simply loss of wages. That's medical bills. Right? If he is struck, you have to heal him. Right? Anything that has to do, by the way, even additional medical costs. So, like, it's not just the immediate cost. Sometimes you hurt somebody. There could be, think about, for example, God forbid, a person gets in a car accident. So there could be long-term effects. So anything that has to do with the original wound, you are still on the hook for. Even if it heals and it keeps opening up, you still need to pay for it until it's taken care of. If it's totally healed, after it's healed, you don't need to pay for anything. So that's how you take care of medical bills. What about shevet? Shevet again refers to the loss of work. So again, loss of work should be pretty easy. So shevet, we see the person as if he was a cucumber salesman or a cucumber picker, really. We want to know, again, picking cucumbers is easy work. Even if you're missing a limb, you could do it. So how much are the wages a person could get for that? And whatever those wages, you need to pay him. And finally, boshet, embarrassment. You need to pay for the embarrassment you've caused him. All has to do with the person who is creating the embarrassment and the person who himself was embarrassed. So for example, if you're the president of the United States or a king, certain things might be much more embarrassing than if you are not. If you're a guy who's pretty easygoing and you don't mind jokes, certain embarrassments might not affect you too much. And so it's all relative, the Mishnah tells us. And more than that, the Mishnah actually brings out an interesting case, which is, let's say a person is blind and he can't see how you've embarrassed him. He doesn't see people laughing at him. So should that make a difference? Or for example, what happens if you're naked, right? And someone embarrasses you like that, you're already naked. What's the difference, right? And so the Mishnah tells us that you still need to pay. You still need to pay for those things. Let's say you embarrass somebody who is sleeping. You still need to. So again, the Mishnah here is outlining the big takeaway. It's a long Mishnah with a lot of ideas here. But the main takeaway from this Mishnah is that there are 5 different categories of justice, of financial payment, restitution that's made. It's not just that I give you a couple bucks and say, hey, I'm sorry I hit your car. I'm sorry I hurt you. Here's $1,000. I hope it goes away. The Torah goes into depths to understand what this is like. And so, and why is this the approach? Why is this better? So the Bechor Shor says it quite explicitly. So, Adam may meet Adam, when you kill a person, right? If a person was murdered, you can't make it up to him in finances. Therefore, if you kill a person, you deserve death. If you go and chop off his arms, if Mr. Smith's hand gets chopped off, what good is it going to do if the person who chopped off his hand gets chopped off? Doesn't help me, doesn't make me feel better. And so the Bechor Shor is arguing that justice is defined by restitution, by making the person whole again. A third possibility that I'll just share with you, or let me say it differently, not third possibility, but rather, so we have these 2 approaches. We have the approach here of that it's financial, or that maybe it's literally physical payment. That's how we deal with justice. Now, the challenge is that we still have these different psukim. Why does the Torah use such literal language of ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye? What's the significance of this? So some suggest, for instance, that it's because there can be different cases. So for example, we saw earlier in Josephus that justice should be, Josephus said, let the person choose. If he wants money, if he wants restitution, let him take money. If he wants to take off the guy's hand because he's so angry and wants to make him equal and wants retribution, then he can do that. The Ibn Ezra says that it's the perpetrator's choice, right? The guy who does the bad deed, he gets to decide whether he wants to pay money or whether he wants to lose a limb. Shadal says the court gets to choose, right? Ramban makes a difference, for example, between whether or not this is permanent loss or temporary loss. So one possibility that the Torah here is giving us both the financial case from source 4 and the primary source of ayin tachat ayin to tell us that there can be different cases depending on the court, the perpetrator, the victim, about what it is that they want. That's one possibility. A second possibility as to why the Torah gives us such literal eye for an eye, instead of just telling us straight out financially that a person needs to make payments, might have to do with something very fascinating known as like the changing world. So the Ho'il Moshe over here in box number 9, he suggests that the literal interpretation of the pasuk was actually its intended meaning for the generation specifically from the Exodus. But the metaphorical understanding that we know that it has to do with financial payments, that was really important for every other generation, right? The uncivilized society of a bunch of slaves who just left Egypt, they needed a very strict and harsh penal code. And monetary punishments would not have worked enough to deter them from doing it. They were slaves. They needed an eye for an eye. But in our timeline today, or again, not today, after that generation, that's no longer reasonable. We don't need such strict punishments. And this is exactly what he says, right? This is how the Jewish people were back then. They needed they needed very, very tough penal code, a very tough rules for justice for that generation. And that's why the Torah says an eye for an eye. But in our generation, in our time, or after that generation, that's not how we define justice. That's not how it works at all. So that's another way of looking at it, that society evolves, which makes me think a lot about when we think about laws from the Torah, how do those laws evolve, or how do we take those laws and implement them in a constantly evolving world? The last idea that I want to mention to you actually comes from the Sforno, and I'll say it outside, it's this last source over here, about why the Torah gives such literal descriptions. What I want to suggest, based on the Sforno's interpretation, is that this is really just a difference between ideal and reality. The Torah is not just a book of laws, but rather the Torah is a book that we're meant to strive to, right? The formulation is meant to convey that the perpetrator truly deserves to lose a limb, even though it's not the punishment which is actually implemented. And so the Sforno says that while strict justice would require an eye for an eye, measure for measure retribution, practically that's not possible. And so the Torah is trying to hold us up to tell us that's what should be. We should understand how significant of an action is when you hurt a person in such a way. And the Torah here is trying to say to us that there is an ideal that we need to strive for, even if it's not practical. In other words, sometimes in life, there can be things that we're asked to do that doesn't seem reasonable, doesn't seem like it makes sense. And so sometimes we can find ways out, we can find different interpretations that doesn't take anything away from what the ideal that the Torah is trying to lay out for us. And so what we've spent some time doing today is trying to define what justice means. Does it have to do with retribution? Does it have to do with restitution, deterrence, etc.? And I think by and large, the Torah here is trying to balance all of those different pieces to create a justice that is fair, that is equitable, and that also creates a better society, not only back in those times, but for all of us today as well. So let's stop here and stay warm. I wish everybody a great day. I'm looking forward to seeing you all real soon.